There are mornings a man never forgets, mornings that start out like a dream and end like a storm. For Dalton Keane, it was the morning he thought he was riding up to his brand new home, until he saw the thin curl of smoke rising from the chimney. After 3 months drowning in bitter failure, losing his ranch, his cattle, and the last scrap of pride when he had to sign away the deed to a creditor, Dalton scraped together the final coins he had left to buy a remote cabin in the northern mountains. He'd bought it sight unseen on nothing more than a hastily signed bill of sale from a man in town who claimed he needed cash fast. For Dalton, it was the last rope to pull himself back into life. That morning, as the wagon wheels clattered over the narrow trail winding through the pine forest, Dalton imagined stepping into a long-abandoned place, dust-heavy on the furniture windows, groaning on their hinges. He'd build a fire, set the bed back in place, hang his old saddle on the wall, and sit by the window watching the golden light spill across the trees, his own quiet new beginning. But then, he saw its smoke curling straight up into the blue sky. Smoke meant fire. Fire meant someone was here, and that someone was living in the cabin he had bought with the very last of his money. Dalton tightened the reins. His roan gelding snorted, picking up on the tension in its rider. Dalton ground his teeth. After all he'd lost, this was the one thing he couldn't bear. Some stranger laying claim to the only roof he had left in the world. The cabin appeared after the final bend, small weather-beaten gray from sun and wind, but sturdy. Morning light streamed through the tall pines, breaking into trembling gold across the walls. And just as he feared, there was movement inside. Through the single window, a shadow shifted passing by. Dalton didn't knock. He'd decided long before stepping down from the wagon that whoever was inside would be leaving, whether man-woman or an entire family. But when his rough palm pushed open the weather-worn door, his world came to a halt in an endless instant. It wasn't some ragged young drifter, not a drunk or a down-on-his-luck prospector. Standing by the hearth, her hair a deep burnished red in the shaft of sunlight pouring through the window, was a woman. Green eyes, wide and steady, fixed on his, as if weighing his worth in the first heartbeat. The room didn't look like a squat. Everything was neat, cared for. A jar of wildflowers sat on the table. The smell of fresh-baked bread overpowered the musty scent of old pine boards. Dalton felt absurdly like he was the intruder, even though the deed to the place was in his vest pocket. "You must be the new owner," she said, her voice unnervingly calm. "I've been expecting you." Dalton took off his hat, not sure why he felt compelled to. "Name's Dalton Keane. I bought this cabin, and I've got the papers to prove it." The woman gave a slow nod, as if she'd heard those exact words before. "I'm Kora Lane, and before you ask me to leave—" She paused, her gaze holding his without flinching. "You should know that I can't." Can't, the word slid into Dalton's mind like a thin blade, sharp and deliberate. Not won't, not don't want to. Can't, as if there was an entire story crouched behind it, waiting to strike. Dalton's hand curled into a fist. He had come here to rebuild his life, not to get tangled in someone else's trouble. But from the moment he saw those green eyes, proud, yet carrying some desperate weight, he knew nothing was going to go according to plan. Outside, the sun still spilled softly across the forest floor. But inside that cabin, the air felt different, thicker, heavier, carrying the scent of a secret Dalton had no idea he was about to be dragged into. Dalton still stood in the doorway, his hand not fully leaving the worn wooden latch. The air inside the cabin was warmer than the morning chill outside, but it wasn't any more comfortable. Kora's "I can't" still tapped at his mind, slow and deliberate, like a knock he couldn't ignore. "Can't leave?" Dalton asked, his voice low and steady, careful not to make it sound like an accusation. Kora remained by the fireplace, the yellow firelight brushing across her face and deepening the green in her eyes. She gave a small nod, but didn't rush to explain. Instead, her gaze flicked toward the window, then back to him, as if weighing whether he was someone she could trust. "Is someone looking for you?" Dalton pressed the uneasy feeling that had been creeping in since he saw the smoke, now fully awake. Kora exhaled slowly, her hands drawing together in front of her stomach without her even realizing it. "Marcus Webb," she said, each syllable heavy as a stone. He's not just looking for me. He's hunting me." Dalton didn't recognize the name, but the way she spoke, it made it feel like a cold blade against his throat. He folded his arms, shifting his stance so he could still see the side window. Why? She was quiet for a long beat, as though every word she was about to speak carried a piece of a memory she wished she could bury. "My father. Before he died, he fell deep into debt, trying to pay for his medicine. Marcus said he'd erase the debt if I agreed to be his wife." Dalton's brows drew together. "And you accepted?" "Not because I wanted to." Her voice roughened. I thought, if it meant my father could keep his home in his final months, I could endure it. I was wrong. The fire popped, but Dalton realized that wasn't the only sound. Outside, the wind slipped through the pines with a whisper, carrying the uneasy sense that someone might be standing just out of sight. He shifted closer to the wall, partly to block the draft, partly to block any eyes that might be looking in. "What's he like?" Dalton asked. Kora met his eyes this time without hiding. Violent, controlling. To Marcus, people aren't people, they're property. He believes anything he puts his hand on belongs to him, including me. A chill ran down Dalton's spine. He'd met men like that out on the frontier, the kind who knew no limits, who thought law was something you could buy or bend. But in Kora's eyes, he saw something worse, not just fear, but the memory of months spent cornered with no way out. "How long have you been running? 4 months. She glanced at the window again. "I chose this place because I thought no one knew about it. The last owner didn't care, as long as I kept the place clean and quiet. But Marcus," her voice dropped to a near whisper, "he has ways of finding everything." Dalton's eyes fell to the jar of fresh wildflowers on the table, bright, even in the cold spring air. She hadn't been living here like a fugitive passing through. She'd made a home, however temporary, which told him something. Kora wasn't just running from Marcus. She was protecting something. "What would you do if I told you to leave?" Dalton asked, still watching the window. "Go where Kora shot back instantly. Hide in town, Marcus has people everywhere. Or get dragged back, and this time he won't give me a second chance to escape." That told Dalton everything. This wasn't about a stubborn woman refusing to move. This was about survival. Outside, a dry branch cracked. Soft, but in the air wound tight as wire, it was enough to make both of them glance toward the door. Dalton's hand slid to the grip of his gun, an old instinct flaring to life. He didn't know who or what was out there, but he was certain of one thing. Whatever danger was coming had to do with this woman. Kora stepped back, closing the gap between them to just a few feet. "If you think I'm a burden, just say it," she said, her voice steady, but carrying a deep exhaustion. "I've heard it enough to know people usually choose to walk away." Dalton looked at her for a long moment. Maybe he should turn his back, let her face her fate alone. But out here, where people were often the only lifeline one another had, walking away from someone like her was cutting away a piece of your own conscience. He stepped to the table and set his hat down. "We're not done talking, Miss Lane," Dalton said slowly. "But if Marcus Webb really is hunting you, then first, we'd better be ready." Neither of them knew that this moment, just before the sound of hoofbeats in the distance, would mark the line between the story of two strangers and a fight for life neither of them had chosen. The crack of a breaking branch out in the timber wasn't Dalton's imagination. Seconds later, he heard something else, the steady, heavy rhythm of hoofbeats drifting up from the slope below the cabin. Not one horse. 3. Kora froze by the window, her eyes going wide. Oh, God. She backed away until her spine nearly touched the wall. It's them. Dalton didn't need to ask who they were. He moved up beside her, just close enough to peer through the curtain. 3 riders were making their way up, not rushing, but the way they sat their saddles and kept tight formation said clear as day they weren't here for a friendly visit. The lead man was tall, broad-shouldered, with a thick black beard and a sidearm worn like it had been part of him for years. The other 2, one wiry and sharp-eyed, the other wide-shouldered and silent, as Stone rode to either side like escorts for a prisoner. "How many people knew I bought this place?" Dalton asked quietly, eyes still locked on the riders. "No one," Kora answered, her breath unsteady. I prayed they'd never find this place. But Marcus, she swallowed hard. He always does. The lead rider reined in, hard stopping right at the porch. Bay black and a pale gray horse all shifted restlessly after the long climb. Dalton heard the creak of leather, the jingle of spurs against the porch steps. Then came the knock, hard heavy rattling the frame. Open up. I know you're in there, Kora. The black-bearded man's voice filled the cabin thick with the authority of someone used to being obeyed. Kora gripped the edge of the table, her face going pale. Dalton leaned closer, his voice pitched so only she could hear. If you want me to say something, now's the time. No, she whispered, almost pleading. Don't let them know you've seen me. But the words had barely left her lips before the latch turned. The door swung wide, and 3 men stepped inside like they'd never heard of knocking. The leader's eyes swept the room and locked onto Kora. A cold smile curled across his mouth. There you are, darling. Made me chase you halfway to hell. Dalton stepped forward, planting himself between them. This is private property. You're trespassing. The bearded man turned his attention to Dalton, sizing him up like a hunter judging his prey. Name's Marcus Webb. The woman behind you is my wife, and she's coming home with me. I'm not your wife, Kora said, her voice sharper than Dalton had yet heard it. That ceremony was forced, and you know it. Marcus's smile didn't change, but something dangerous flickered in his eyes. The law says otherwise, and out here, the law's all that matters. Dalton could feel his hand hovering near his Colt. 3 to 1 was bad math, especially when he didn't yet know exactly what he was fighting for beyond Kora's "I can't leave." I bought this cabin legally, Dalton said, voice level. Miss Lane is my guest. That makes this my concern. Marcus tilted his head like he was trying to read him. Guessed how long you known her, Cowboy? He dragged out guest with a sneer. Long enough to know she's not going anywhere she doesn't want to go, Dalton replied. Marcus nodded slowly, his faint smile never touching his eyes. I was hoping to settle this civilized. But looks like you've decided to stick your nose where it don't belong. The wiry man to Marcus's left set his hand on his gun, but Marcus held up a palm to stop him, still watching Dalton. You strike me as a reasonable man. Walk away, nobody gets hurt. This is family business, ain't yours. Dalton felt Kora trembling just behind him, but she hadn't bolted or begged. That wasn't the posture of someone helpless. It was someone used to staring down a storm. Nobody belongs to anybody. Dalton said each word, slow and clear. Something shifted in Marcus's face. A thick silence settled over the room. Then he wandered toward the hearth, glancing at the flowers in the jar. The fresh bread on the table, like every item in this cabin, and every person in it, was just another piece of property to collect. Nice place, he said flatly. If she'd rather live here than come home, then... He turned to the wiry man. Burn it. The order landed like a stone in Dalton's gut. The wiry man moved immediately toward the fireplace, snatching up a burning log. Kora gasped softly. Dalton felt something inside him snap. This wasn't about paperwork anymore. This was about survival for both of them. I put everything I had into this place, Dalton set his hand, now firmly on his gun. You burn it. You destroy my livelihood. Marcus shrugged. Should have minded your own business. The third man, silent until now, drew his revolver and leveled it at Dalton's chest. Boss says step aside. I'd do it if I were you. Dalton measured the moment. 3 guns. One of him, and a woman at his back. But out here, decisions weren't always about whether you could win. They were about whether you could live with yourself afterward. He looked at Kora. She was still holding her arms close over her stomach, like she was protecting something more precious than her own life. And in that instant, Dalton knew he wasn't backing down. The air inside the cabin felt thick, as if the fire in the hearth was swallowing every breath. The wiry man still clutched the burning log, the glow of embers casting strange shadows across his face. The big man kept his revolver leveled square at Dalton's chest, the black barrel glinting like a cold warning. Marcus Webb stood in the center of the room, eyes narrowing in calculation. Slowly he raised a hand, signaling his men to stop. Actually, he said, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a man who'd just thought of something amusing. I've got a better way to end this. Dalton didn't drop his hand from the butt of his Colt, but he didn't draw either. He knew Marcus was changing the rules, and for men like him, rules were made to be bent. Marcus took a step forward, closing the space between them to just a few strides. You want to play the hero cowboy, fine. One-on-one. Just you and me. We draw, see who's faster. Dalton's eyes flickered, but his voice stayed steady. If I win, Marcus's smile was thin, never touching his eyes. Me and my boys ride out. We never touch her again. And if I lose, Dalton asked, though he already knew the answer. Then you get buried right out there, Marcus said lightly, as if he were discussing the weather. And she comes home with me like she should have in the first place. Kora's eyes went wide, her knuckles turning white on the edge of the table. No, she said quickly, stepping forward. I'm not letting you die for me, Mr. Keane. You don't even know me. Dalton didn't look back at her. In his mind was the image of her by the window shielding her stomach with both hands, her eyes holding equal parts pride and fear. He didn't know her whole story, but he knew enough to understand she carried something that should never end up in Marcus Webb's hands. I know one thing, Dalton said, eyes locked on Marcus. She's carrying a child, and that child doesn't deserve a father like you. A spark of rage flashed in Marcus's eyes. You think it's yours, cowboy? It's not Kora, cutting her voice sharper now. And it's not yours either, Marcus. You know that. Color rose in Marcus's face, his jaw muscles twitching. Everything about you belongs to me, Kora, including what's growing inside you. The words made Dalton's blood heat. He'd lost his ranch, his money, even his brother. But he wasn't about to lose the last piece of his humanity by standing still while a woman was dragged back into hell. All right, Dalton said, his voice like steel. One-on-one. Marcus nodded, satisfaction flickering across his face. Good. Outside. His two men stepped aside, anticipation gleaming in their eyes. Dalton took off his hat and set it on the table. As he turned, he caught Kora looking at him, her gaze trying to hold him back. You don't know how fast he is, she whispered as he passed her. I've seen him kill a man, before the other fellow even cleared leather. Dalton paused for half a heartbeat, laying his hand over hers where it rested on the table. Then believe I'll be faster. The door opened, letting in the sharp, cold bite of morning light. Outside the clearing stretched wide enough for two men to stand 20 paces apart. Marcus took his place opposite, standing straight as a fence post, his hand hanging loose above his holster. The wiry man and the big one moved to the side, their eyes glued to every twitch. Dalton drew in a deep breath. He could feel each heartbeat, each inhale, the world narrowing until there was nothing but Marcus, the gun, and the stretch of ground between life and death. Marcus smirked. On 3. 1. Dalton fixed on Marcus's hand on the smug certainty of a man who thought he'd already won. 2. The wind whispered through the pines, rustling the needles. Dalton heard it like his brother Samuel's voice from the old days on the range. Shoot straight. Stand steady. Don't blink. 3. Both hands moved. Steel flashed. The gunshot tore the morning open. And in a heartbeat, everything would be decided for all three of them. Dalton had just stepped off the porch when a light hand caught his arm. Kora. She looked at him, her breathing quick, but her eyes holding a strange, fierce certainty. Before you go out there, you need to know something, she whispered, as if the words carried a weight that could crush them both. Marcus isn't just my husband, Kora said, her voice tight and low. He's the man who killed your brother. Dalton froze. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to drain of sound. The wind, the horses shifting, the crunch of boots on dirt, all of it fell into a cold, heavy silence. Samuel Keane. He was your brother, wasn't he? Kora went on, almost certain. 6 months ago, he was shot dead on a lonely trail. Folks said it was bandits. Dalton's grip on his holster tightened, his eyes darkening. You certain I heard Marcus brag about it? Kora said, her voice trembling not with fear, but with disgust. He told his men he killed a rancher who wouldn't sell his water rights. He described everything, the man's horse, the scar on his left hand. The scar only family would know. And he kept something. She swallowed hard. Your brother's silver watch. He wore it like a trophy. Heat rushed into Dalton's head. Samuel, his older brother, the man who'd taught him to shoot to ride, and to never back down from what's right, had been taken from him without warning, and the man standing just yards away in the clearing was the one responsible. Outside, Marcus still stood tall in the open space, his hand dangling over the butt of his gun, as if savoring every second of the wait. Dalton took a long breath and stepped down off the porch, each step feeling heavy as iron. He stopped exactly 20 paces from Marcus, his voice carrying for all to hear. "Before we do this, I've got one question for you, Marcus Webb." Marcus arched a brow, his mouth curling into a mocking smile. "Go on, cowboy. You know, a man named Samuel Keane Dalton said each word a hammer blow in the air. A rancher who wouldn't sell his water rights, shot dead on the North Trail 6 months back." For the briefest flicker, something passed across Marcus's face. Then his smile changed truer, sharper, and stripped of any false civility. "Oh, so that was your brother?" Marcus said, his voice almost pleased. The stubborn fool thought principles were worth more than his life. The words hit Dalton like a hammer, but they also gave him something he'd hungered for these past 6 months. Certainty. No more doubt. No more guessing. This was the man who had stolen his brother's life. "And you know what the best part is?" Marcus tilted his head, grinning like a wolf. "Now I get to finish what I missed that day, send the little brother after him." Dalton straightened his hand, loosening, then tightening again on the gun grip. He wasn't thinking about the cabin or the armed men nearby, or even the fact that he might not walk away. All he saw was his target and the debt that needed to be paid. The wind whispered through the pines, carrying the resin-sweet scent of sap and the dry tang of dust. The sky was bright, but in that clearing the air felt thick enough to split. Marcus smirked. Ready Cowboy Dalton locked eyes with the man who had shattered his family. "I've been ready for 6 months." On 3, Marcus called. Off to the side, Kora's hands were clenched so tight her knuckles had gone white, her lips pressed to a bloodless line. Marcus's 2 men stepped wide, eager for the blood to start. 1. Marcus's boot shifted slightly, lining up his stance. Dalton drew in a breath, feeling his heartbeat thump in his ears. In his mind, Samuel's voice came back from those days on the open range. "Keep it straight, don't rush, and don't blink." 2. The world narrowed to Marcus's hand on his gun and the space between them. 3. The gunshot ripped the morning apart. The powder smoke drifted, and in that instant Dalton knew this was the end of Marcus, of him, and of the blood debt that had haunted him for half a year. Dalton's shot cracked through the morning air, shattering the cold stillness. As the thin haze of gun smoke drifted away, Marcus Webb stood frozen for a split second, eyes wide with disbelief. Then his tall, broad frame crumpled to the ground, his hand still loosely gripping the revolver, never having fully cleared leather. Dalton straightened, breathing slow, but eyes sharp. He didn't allow himself to relax. Not here. Not now. At his feet lay the man who had murdered his brother, blood seeping quickly into the dusty earth. For a brief heartbeat, Dalton felt something heavy lift from his shoulders, the 6-month-old debt finally paid. But the moment didn't last. The sound yanked him back, the click of hammers cocking the scrape of boots on dirt. Marcus's 2 hired hands had drawn their weapons, their faces tight with rage and shock. The wiry one leveled his gun square at Dalton's chest, spitting the words through clenched teeth. "Boss might be dead, but you killed him. That makes you a hunted man." Dalton knew he was in a bad spot. His Colt was empty. Reloading would take seconds he didn't have. He calculated in an instant, searching for anything cover, distraction, and edge. The bigger man took a step forward, his voice a low growl. "You should have stayed out of it, cowboy. Now it's too late." Before either man could pull the trigger, a sharp rifle crack split the air from the direction of the cabin. The bullet struck the wiry man in the shoulder, spinning him sideways. His gun hit the dirt, his shout of pain tangled with a string of curses. Dalton dropped low, rolled to the side, and in one quick motion scooped up the fallen revolver. When he came up, he saw Kora standing in the cabin doorway, her shoulder snug against the stock of an old hunting rifle. Her face was cold-focused, nothing like the frightened woman he'd first met. "The next shot won't be a warning," she called, her voice ringing with authority. The bigger man froze. His eyes flicked from Dalton, now armed again, to Kora with the rifle, then down to Marcus's body lying in the dust. Hesitation crossed his face, and survival instinct won. "Not worth it," he muttered, turning sharply and swinging into the saddle. Moments later, the pounding of his horse's hooves was already fading down the trail. Dalton rose to his feet, breathing hard, but never taking his eyes off the retreating figure until he disappeared over the ridge. Kora stepped away from the doorway, still holding the rifle, as she walked toward him. The wind tugged at her red hair, but her green eyes held no fear, now only resolve, and a faint glimmer of relief. The wiry man, still clutching his wounded shoulder, began crawling toward his horse. Dalton stepped in, nudging the man's revolver farther out of reach with his boot. "You'll live," Dalton said flatly. "But remember, this one person stopped you from killing me." He nodded toward Kora. Next time, she might not aim for the shoulder. The man didn't need telling twice. Gritting his teeth against the pain, he hauled himself into the saddle and spurred his horse down the same path his partner had taken. The clearing fell quiet again, broken only by the sigh of the wind through the pines and the steady breathing of the two left standing. Dalton looked down at Marcus one last time. There was no triumph in his face, only the quiet gravity of a man who had done what had to be done. Kora stood beside him, lowering the rifle but keeping it in her hands. "If I hadn't fired," she began softly, "then both of us would be lying here," Dalton said, glancing at her. "Thank you." Their eyes met and held for a long, unspoken moment. In that look was gratitude, newfound trust, and something deeper neither dared name. Dalton turned back toward the cabin, setting the rifle on the table before reloading his Colt. "We're not safe yet," he said. "The one who ran off won't forget this. He'll be back, and he might bring more with him." Kora gave a small nod, her gaze sharpening again. But when her eyes swept over the clearing, settling on where Marcus Webb had fallen, she knew part of the nightmare was over. And if they had to fight to keep this hard-won freedom, she was ready. The sound of hoofbeats rose again from the slope, this time not one or two horses, but a whole group. Dalton and Kora turned toward it, their eyes instantly tense. Instinct told them these might not be allies, or at least not yet. From the tree line, 7 riders emerged. At their head was a man in his 50s, wearing a long brown coat with a silver badge gleaming on his chest. His face was weathered by sun and wind, his dark eyes the kind that had seen far too much. "Kora Lane," he called, his voice deep, but clear as the horses came to a stop in front of the porch. "Marcus Webb told me you'd been taken by bandits. Said he was leading a party to find you when—" His gaze dropped to Marcus's body, lying sprawled in the dirt, then shifted quickly to Dalton, standing with a gun in his hand. "I come across this." The deputies fanned out, forming a half circle around the cabin. One kept a firm grip on his reins, the other hand resting on the butt of his revolver, ready to draw. Dalton didn't lower his Colt, but he raised his voice. "Sheriff Morrison Marcus Webb didn't tell you the whole story. He forced Kora into a sham marriage, threatened to kill her. And—" Dalton paused, pulling a silver watch from his pocket. "He murdered my brother, Samuel Keane." Sheriff Morrison's brow furrowed as he swung down from his horse. "That's a serious charge, Keane. You got proof I do." Kora's voice came from just behind Dalton. She stepped forward, holding a bundle of papers tied with string. "These are the documents Marcus forced my dying father to sign. Debt notes, a marriage agreement, all written in Marcus's own hand, with threats included. None of it legal." Morrison took the bundle, flipping through a few pages, his frown deepening. "This is enough to charge him with extortion." Dalton handed over the watch. "Sheriff, this belonged to Samuel Keane. You know it. He showed it to you when you two worked that cattle theft case 3 years ago. Initials SK inside." Sheriff Morrison opened the watch, seeing the carved letters and the distinctive scratches. His eyes darkened. "I remember. Samuel never went anywhere without it. And there's more." Dalton flipped the watch open again, removing a small folded scrap of paper from inside. A map. Samuel drew it. In the corner, it says, "For my brother Dalton, if anything happens to me." Morrison took it, spreading it out across his saddle. The pencil lines were old but clear, a route leading up into the northern mountains, ending at a crude symbol of a cave. "What do you think it means Samuel knew Marcus would kill him? He hid the evidence, their records, that could bring down Marcus's entire operation. One of the deputies cut in, jerking a thumb toward the wiry wounded man slumped near a tree. "Sheriff, this one says they killed Marcus while he was trying to rescue his wife." "He didn't rescue anyone," Kora said coldly. "He came to take me back, burn this cabin, and kill anyone who stood in his way." Sheriff Morrison was silent for a few beats, then looked to his men. "Tie him up. We'll see how his story holds up next to these papers." Two deputies hauled the wounded man away. Morrison turned back to Dalton and Kora. "If this map's real, we need to find that evidence now. The longer it sits, the more likely it disappears." 3 days later, the party Dalton, Kora, and 3 deputies stood at the mouth of a cave hidden behind a rocky outcrop in the northern range. The wind blew cold through the pines, but everyone felt the heat of what they were about to uncover. Dalton went in, first lantern sweeping across the dark. A few yards in, the light caught a low wooden chest blanketed in dust and cobwebs. He knelt, pried it open. Inside were thick bundles of papers, cloth sacks stuffed with ledgers, and several cracked leather journals. Morrison picked one up, flipping through quickly. The pages listed ranchers' names, amounts of money, stolen water rights, and dealt with column names of those killed, including Samuel Keane. "Lord Almighty," one deputy muttered. "This is an entire criminal empire." Morrison shut the ledger, his face grim. "This'll put a lot of folks in prison. Not just Marcus's thugs, some of the officials who covered for him, too." Kora stood close to Dalton, her hand brushing his arm. "Your brother. He risked his life to leave us this." Dalton nodded slowly, fingers tightening on the worn scrap of the map. "And now, it's going to end all of it." A month later, the news had spread through the territory. Marcus Webb's network dismantled several officials stripped of office-stolen property, returned to the families it had been taken from. The court declared Kora's marriage void, awarding her damages from Marcus's seized estate. Dalton, standing on the porch of the cabin, watched Kora smile as a deputy handed over the final set of legal papers. This time, justice wasn't just a word. It had come, though, bought at the highest price. The May wind drifted gently across the cabin porch, carrying the sweet scent of wildflowers and fresh spring grass. 6 months had passed since Marcus Webb had fallen in the dirt out front, and in that time, everything had changed. The territorial court had officially declared Kora's marriage to Marcus null and void, calling it an act of coercion with no legal standing. The ruling not only restored her freedom, but also awarded her damages from Marcus's estate land cattle, and enough cash to ensure the child she carried would never want for anything. The day the verdict came down, Kora had stood on the cabin steps, both hands on her belly, her eyes shining like someone who'd just had a mountain lifted off her chest. Dalton, returning from town with his saddlebags full of supplies, had seen that smile, a smile of freedom, true freedom, for the first time on her face. Now on a sunlit spring morning, Dalton leaned against the porch rail, watching Kora hang laundry on the line. The light blue maternity dress she wore curved gently over the full roundness of her late pregnancy. She moved slowly, carefully, but still with the grace and self-assurance of a woman who knew she was safe. "This little one's been kicking hard today," Kora said, smoothing her belly with a hint of laughter in her eyes. "Little one." "Huh?" Dalton asked, stepping down from the porch. "Or a boy," she replied, smiling with playful mischief. "But I'm keeping my promise. If it's a boy, he'll be named Samuel. I want him to know he's named for a man who lived and died for what was right." Dalton was quiet for a moment. That name had always carried pain, but now hearing it from Kora, he realized it was the best way to turn loss into a legacy. Samuel would have liked that he said, his voice roughening just a touch. He always believed folks found each other when they needed each other most. Kora placed her hand over his, their fingers weaving together. Maybe he was right. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here. They stood like that for a while, saying nothing more. Beyond the porch, the meadow rolled out in a green sweep of spring grass, and the mountains stood far off, silent and steady like sentinels. Since the dust had settled, Dalton and Kora had worked together to rebuild the cabin. The roof had been re-shingled, a new stall added to the barn, and the garden out back was already yielding its first harvest of the season. At night, they sat together on the porch, oil lamp light flickering between them, telling stories no one else would ever hear. Life on the American frontier was never entirely peaceful. Dalton knew that even though Marcus was gone, there were always men with grudges or greed who might come looking. He kept his guns cleaned every week, reins hung ready on the porch post, and his eyes sharp for strangers on the trail. Kora understood that, but she refused to let fear swallow their days. She poured her energy into preparing for the baby, stitching tiny shirts, folding soft blankets, sometimes sitting at the window in the afternoon light, dreaming about a future filled with a child's laughter in these rooms. On quiet evenings, they talked about what would come after the baby arrived. Dalton imagined expanding the livestock, maybe a few milk cows, maybe try sheep for wool. Kora wanted to plant apple and peach trees so she could sell preserves in town. "We won't be rich," Dalton said during one of those talks, "but we'll live well and free." "That's all I've ever wanted," Kora answered. For Americans of that time, freedom wasn't just a flag flying over the courthouse or words on a paper in town. It was standing on your own land, working with your own hands, and knowing no one had the right to take away your home or your family. Dalton and Kora had fought for that freedom, and it hadn't come cheap. They had paid in blood and grief, and in long nights not knowing if the dawn would ever come. That's why their story is worth remembering, because it reminds us that justice sometimes survives only if ordinary people have the courage to defend it. If you're hearing this story, I want you to remember one thing. Dalton wasn't some legendary gunfighter, and Kora wasn't born to be a heroine. They were just two ordinary people shoved into extraordinary circumstances. But it was their decision not to back down that changed everything. Now, as the sunset poured gold over the meadow, Kora leaned back in the wooden chair on the porch, her hands resting on her belly, feeling the small, strong movements inside. Dalton sat beside her, his eyes fixed on the trail leading into the trees the same trail trouble had once come down. Someday that trail might bring new challenges, but they'd face them together, just like they had before. And if you believe in their story, you can support them not with money or guns, but by remembering that somewhere out there, people like Dalton and Kora still exist. They're proof that even in the wildest parts of America, integrity and kindness can take root and grow. The question now is this: when the child is born, how will Dalton and Kora raise him or her to understand the value of freedom their parents fought for? Maybe the answer will come in each new spring, each early morning on the porch, and in the stories they'll tell of a time when justice existed only because you were brave enough to stand for it.